Pretty cool guy, I know. If you want to be able to earn enough money to afford, yeah, that's right, it's a cordless hedge trimmer, then you should watch my videos in which I'll tell you all the secrets about how to be able to afford that's a battery, a wireless hedge trimmer.
Final Fantasy VII released on PC in 1998, a year and a half after its bar-raising, game-changing, seismic shift-shifting debut on PlayStation. It was a direct port of the console version, with a dedicated development team working to bring it across, and Square had high hopes for its performance on the personal computer as the studio's first ever Windows release. It was also one of the most interesting, impossible ports ever made. The intrigue starts with something as simple as the fact that Japanese RPGs just weren't really ported to PC in the 90s. They were hardly translated to English for Western console releases, never mind rejigged and reworked to function on a platform with very little popularity in their home region. But Square, Final Fantasy VII's developer and Japanese publisher, wanted to test the waters, to see if there was a market for its games in a new pool of players it hadn't yet dipped its toe into. The decision was made. The adventures of Cloud and Tifa and Aerith would come to Windows PCs. There was one problem. Square, again that's Square, the developer and publisher of Final Fantasy VII, didn't have the finished game's source code. There's an incredulousness in the reaction to this claim, one that pops up all over the place both from staunch Square apologists and those with no real skin in the game. Because it's a ludicrous concept that the actual source code for an incredibly important game, the life stream of an entire video game project, might have just fallen by the wayside without so much as a second thought. And I get that. I can see why it might seem utterly inconceivable that Final Fantasy VII's finished source code could be lost. Except it happens in everything. Every creative endeavour and endeavour of any other form. The early days of cinema are largely unknown to us because those early movie makers just didn't think to look after or keep hold of their film reels. The first ever full-length narrative feature film was Australian production The Story of the Kelly Gang, released in 1906. Today, only around 17 minutes of it is known to exist, from an original runtime of around an hour. Countless live TV broadcasts were never officially recorded, and plenty of game show episodes happened once and were never heard from again. But there are plenty of examples of proper TV shows where things were either lost or, famously in the case of the BBC, intentionally deleted or recorded over, often because of a lack of storage capability or just because that's how they did things. Look up the 97 missing episodes of Doctor Who for a great example of that. NASA doesn't have its original tapes from the bloody Apollo 11 moon landing, which is why the only footage we have of one of the most important things that has ever happened is terrible, grainy, degraded TV broadcast level stuff. Books too, works by Herman Melville, Sylvia Plath, Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Hardy. Nobody is immune to things going missing or being destroyed or made to disappear. Shakespeare had at least one play nobody has ever seen or heard from since its lone performance hundreds of years ago, in the shape of Cardenio. And that was performed for a king. It's not like it was one of his early days Amdram theatre group pieces of crap. So for a video game company in the 1990s, lacking digital storage space as it would have been, to opt not to hold on to the source code of a project it was finished with, that it saw no future release plans for at that moment in time, it's not actually that odd a concept. One thing I read said the code was preserved in the then standard fashion for Square by printing it out and storing it physically on reams of paper. In a weird way, that makes it sound more like it could have been lost than not, given the relative fragility of Dead Tree and how people aren't necessarily very careful with their storage of documents. Maybe there could even have been a bit of confusion, the assumption someone else, it's always someone else, was handling the printing of the code so you didn't have to worry about it. An accidental shredding, an intentional shredding, someone borrowing it to study and not bringing it back. A calamitous coffee spill. There are so very many plausible reasons a physical copy of the code could be worse off than a digital one, and so very many more reasons why, annoying and inconceivable as it is, it's very likely to be true that Square indeed didn't preserve the source code for Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation. Adding more than a chunk of credibility to this theory was Yusuke Matsuda, president of Square Enix, who, talking to Game Informer in 2019 about the company's older games, said, "I'm embarrassed to admit it, but in some cases we don't know where the code is anymore. It's very hard to find them sometimes because back in the day you just made them and put them out there and you were done. You didn't think of how you were going to sell them down the road. Sometimes customers ask, why haven't you released that game yet? And the truth of the matter is because we don't know where it's gone." So Square wanted a PC version of Final Fantasy VII, and it didn't have the final source code for the version it had just released on PlayStation. An impossible situation? Well, yes, this is a video about an impossible port after all. The project was passed across the Pacific to Square's Costa Mesa office, known as either Square LA or Square USA, and around 15 to 20 people ended up working on the PC port, though only around half of those were actually in the US office working on the day-to-day dev. With this physical divide, this working culture divide, this time zone divide, I would have paid a sizable chunk of money to be a fly on the wall when the American office asked for the PS1 source code and were either A, told it couldn't be located, or B, handed some code with a note that it wasn't actually the finished version of the game. Oh, the fun times those developers must have seen flashing before their eyes. Because Square Costa Mesa was given Final Fantasy VII source code to work on the port, but it was from an earlier, in-development version of the game, unfinished and with bugs needing to be squashed, and not the final PS1 code. That team of 8 or so developers was tasked with, essentially, refinishing coding a game that had already been made and making it as close to the original as possible, because Square was not keen on any big changes being made. What code was provided proved difficult to understand because it was, Square being in Japan and all, written in Japanese. Documentation, comments were included alongside the code, so things had to be run through a translator at the studio every time there was a particular language barrier in the way. Said translator was not a coder though, so their translations couldn't necessarily bring across the context so important to a developer's note-taking. Eventually, one of the game's original programmers, Kazuma Fuseya, joined the team and became an invaluable source of information to help things toddle along. But for a time, the Costa Mesa studio must have been making painfully slow progress. Around 80% of Final Fantasy VII's game code was rewritten for the PC port, all in all. The lack of final code did of course impact this, but there was also the fact that the process involved taking a game specifically made for the PlayStation and bringing it to a new format, thus necessitating reworking custom written code just so it would work on the PC at all, before any further tinkering could be done. Not only was it a console game being reshaped to fit in a PC-shaped hole, but it was also 5 different engines within the game, all written by different people in the original development team, and all different from one another. The engines, world map, field, battle, menu and minigame all had independent teams working on them and all had their own unique code written to make the most of the PlayStation's hardware. None of them were written with any concern for future porting, it's safe to assume. Unifying all of these engines on the PC while bug squashing unfinished code and fighting through on-the-fly translation of documentation written by the original developers, it was a lot to contend with. And it wasn't just the underlying code. Many assets were either hard to come by or had to be sourced by the porting team itself, depending on who you listen to. Background images, the pre-rendered scenes the polygonal characters ran about on top of, were provided at the PlayStation's resolution of 320 by 240 pixels. The PC version was being made to run at 640 by 480, twice the resolution, meaning those backgrounds would either need to be manually touched up, a genuinely impossible task for the port's lone artist to handle, or they would simply be left alone, thus looking blown up and not so great. The original background images, drawn much larger than downscaled for the PS1 game, weren't available for whatever reason, so it's all the porting team had to work with. Similarly, movie files just weren't provided. FMVs that had been made on kit costing tens of thousands of pounds that had taken many hours to render, and again had likely been done so at a higher resolution before downscaling for the console release, they pulled a no-show. The Costa Mesa branch instead had to grab a finished copy of the game on PlayStation and rip the movies from the discs. The decision to compress the movies even more for the PC game using a frankly terrible codec resulted in a further drop in quality. But hey, the PC game did get a new Chocobo-infused Squaresoft logo as part of the intro movie, so there's that. There also came the rather frightening sight of mouths on characters in the PC version, though this wasn't a conscious decision on the part of the porting team. Rather, something behind the scenes had been toggled from off to on in the character models, which thankfully were provided, and suddenly we had characters with expressionless lines or gaping maws all over the place. Whatever the case, there was no real time for the small team to make significant, meaningful changes, improvements to the game before release, as it was spending so much time fighting countless fires elsewhere. Some of the inaccurate translations were fixed, as you might have expected, so the "this guy are sick" became "this guy is sick," for example, but in a subtle hint that FF7 PC wasn't coming from the same code as the final PS1 game, there were more than a few tweaks and changes that were either seemingly pointless or outright wrong. Time periods changing, English idioms introduced for no particular reason, irrelevant comments used in place of what were correct translations from the Japanese script. Were this pulled straight from the retail version of the game, there would be far fewer examples of this. But as the porting team was working with unfinished code, it had to fill in some of the blanks itself, as well as making some of the changes it felt necessary, like additional chunks of good old-fashioned censorship. Music, too. It's infamous now, but for those of you who weren't aware, the PC port replaced the original game's music with redone versions. The common leap seems to be to say that the PC game had MIDI tracks introduced, which is true, but Final Fantasy VII's PS1 soundtrack was a MIDI one too, so that's not the problem. The problem was PC hardware, and the fact it was impossible to guarantee everyone had the same sound card, unlike on the console where everyone definitely had the same hardware. As such, music tracks that were composed specifically on, for, and by the PS1 sound chip could and would sound fantastic. But those same MIDI tracks, when interpreted by wildly differing sound hardware on PCs around the world, well, let's just say the victory fanfare made my balls shrivel. And we'll just assume that both Cosmo Canyon and One Winged Angel weren't in the PC version because that's a better way to live than knowing they did and they were as bad as they were. No, I'm not playing them, look them up if you must. Okay, so if you installed the Yamaha MIDI driver software that came with the original PC release, and it was compatible with your setup, you'd end up with some decent, orchestral-tinged imitations of the original tracks. But for those who didn't or couldn't do that, they were largely screwed out of one of gaming's most hauntingly beautiful audio experiences. But through all of this, through all the knockbacks, the wild experience of having to deal with a core development team that couldn't actually hand over its core development code, through ruining the music and trying to improve the translation while taking most, but not all, instances of shit out of the game, through all these trials and tribulations came triumph. Final Fantasy VII released on PC in the middle of 1998 and was a big success, selling well over its projected numbers very quickly indeed and ending up with around 1 million full-price copies sold. It was jarring in noticeable ways, and contemporaneous reviews picked up on the weirdness of a terrible numpad-based control scheme, the compressed FMVs and blown-up background images, as well as that soundtrack. It was noticed even then. But it didn't matter. Square had pulled off the impossible port and made its first ever Windows release in the form of one of the most important games ever made. But the story didn't quite end there. Eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed it hasn't been the original PC version of the game running throughout this video, but that's where things get well poetical and beautiful in that circle of life way they tend to. See, this is the PS4 re-release from 2015. That PSN title was, in fact, a port of the game's 2012 PC re-release, which Square Enix brought to the digital market itself before it made the leap a year later to Steam. And that 2012 version, which the PS4 version is a port of, was itself a port of the 1998 PC version. In fact, the PC version of Final Fantasy VII has become the base from which all other ports have been derived. A version of the game patched and hacked together from unfinished PS1 code became the standard, which I find amazing. And even more amazing than that? Well, the PC version's source code was lost too. I know, it's going a bit far now, but the claim was made by the former president of Eidos, Keith Boesky, who told Polygon Square Enix called and asked if he had the PC source code available as they wanted to re-release the game. He, of course, did not. But that re-release still happened in 2012, and the only realistic way Square Enix could have got into the back end and made the significant changes it did to the game for its updated version would be by reverse engineering the 1998 PC game. So the game you see running here is a PS4 port of a reverse-engineered PC update of a hacked-together 1998 PC game based on an unfinished version of a PS1 classic. Talk about impossible. To wrap this all up a bit on a couple of the other games. Final Fantasy VIII ended up going through a similar process of reverse engineering to get its modern do-overs through the door, though, as with the game itself, it's not quite as thrilling as the Final Fantasy VII story. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy IX clearly had its source code available, as the modern re-release of that was successfully ported to the Unity engine. Final Fantasy VIII did not use Unity, which you might think, oh, fair enough about, until you remember its re-release came after Final Fantasy IX's. It's far quicker and therefore more cost-effective to push something into a new engine if you have the source code available than it is when you've had to reverse engineer the entire thing, all because somebody clicked on empty recycle bin back in the 90s. Just saying. Anyway, that's about it. I thought it was an interesting story and a real tale of the impossibilities forced on developers when things just haven't been planned for. Thanks for watching. Bye!